All right. Thank you all for coming to this evening celebrating the release of a new volume of translations of Baha'u'llah's writings, The Call of the Divine Beloved. It's always an amazingly exciting event for Baha'is around the world when new translations are released. And I wanted to offer a few personal thoughts about the volume and its contents this evening, and I wasn't quite sure where to begin, so I thought I would begin at the end and then come back to the beginning. In a celebrated passage from one of his very last works, in the Epistles to the Son of the Wolf, Baha'u'llah wrote that the utterance of God is a lamp whose light is these words: "Ye are the fruits of one tree and the leaves of one branch. Deal ye one with another with the utmost love and harmony, with friendliness and fellowship. He who is a day star of truth beareth me witness. So powerful is the light of unity that it can illuminate the whole earth." Having encapsulated the central theme of his revelation, Baha'u'llah proceeds in that same passage to shed light on the range of voices assumed during the course of that stupendous ministry. At one time, we spoke in the language of the lawgiver, at another in that of the truth seeker and the mystic, and yet our supreme purpose and highest wish hath always been to disclose the glory and sublimity of this station. The volume that was just released brings together a number of tablets among Baha'u'llah's very earliest works, revealed in the voice of the truth seeker and the mystic, a voice that endeavors to awake humanity to the call of the divine beloved. The context of the volume, the tablets that are contained in the volume, were all revealed during approximately the same period, the period of Baha'u'llah's time in Baghdad in the mid to late 1850s. This was also the years prior to his public declaration of his prophetic mission. The volume itself is fairly short. It only includes a few of his mystical works, actually only 7 items, 2 of which actually have existed in earlier translations, the 7 valleys and the 4 valleys. If one were to try to assemble the entire set of works of Baha'u'llah on mystical themes, one would probably be looking at hundreds of works, hundreds of tablets. And likewise, one of these 7 items in this new volume is an item of poetry, and if one were to assemble all of Baha'u'llah's poetry, there also would be quite a number of items beyond that. Baha'u'llah revealed 1 or 2 dozen poems as well. And we're looking at one of the very first attempts at rendering a poem of Baha'u'llah into English. This poem is known by its opening words, Rash-e Amma, which can be translated as the clouds of realms above. It literally means the sprinkling of the cloud, but the literal translation perhaps wouldn't have sounded that poetic. The poem was revealed during Baha'u'llah's confinement in a subterranean dungeon in Tehran in 1852, and it's one of the earliest surviving works of Baha'u'llah and ranks among the very few composed in verse form. It invokes the ineffable experience of the downpour of celestial grace and imparts a first intimation of the world-redeeming mission with which its author had been invested. Describing that initial epiphany, Baha'u'llah writes in the before-mentioned Epistle to the Son of the Wolf, very, very late in his ministry: "During the days I lay in the prison of Tehran, though the galling weight of the chains and the stench-filled air allowed me but little sleep, still in those infrequent moments of slumber I felt as if something flowed from the crown of my head over my breast, even as a mighty torrent that precipitateth itself upon the earth from the summit of a lofty mountain. Every limb of my body would, as a result, be set afire. At such moments my tongue recited what no man could bear to hear. This poem, Rashi Amma, is Baha'u'llah's extended description of that experience he had in the Siyah Shah. It, I think, has been said, I think rightly, that a translation of that, a good translation, an adequate translation of that poem is basically impossible. One either can try to keep it to a literal rendering, in which case it loses this essential poetic dimension in the English. One could, on the other extreme, go for something like Edward Fitzgerald did with the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, and sacrifice to a much greater extent the literal meaning of the words for something very beautiful and very poetic. Or one could try to strike a balance and capture enough of the poetry and enough of the meaning. Unfortunately, in doing so, it will never be either perfectly accurate nor perfectly poetic in English. And so trying to strike the balance in the middle will probably end up satisfying no one. The current translation has, the House of Justice has mentioned, is really on the order of an initial attempt, and it may be that further attempts may be made. There actually have been many attempts to translate this poem, some of which have been available on the internet for many years, and there were, I believe, at least 8 different versions of it that the research department had to draw upon in trying to come up with an adequate rendering of the poem. To try to give you some sense of the poetic nature of it in the original, I thought I might try to read the first few lines of it in the Persian, and for the non-Persian speakers among us, you can at least, I think, hear some of the poetry of it. It begins, Rash Amma as jazbe ma mirizad, serre wafa as nagme ma mirizad, از باد صبا مشک خطا گشته پدید و این نفحه خوش از جعده ما میریزد. شمس تراز از طلعت حق کرده طلوع، سر حقیقت بین که از وجه سا میریزد. بحر صفا از موج لقا کرده خروش و این طرف عطا از جذبه ها mirizad. So every line in the Rashi Amma ends with this word mirizad, which means is drifting down, or is raining down, or is sprinkling down. And an attempt was made in the translation to render that through the repetition and the ending of each line with the phrase is raining down. So the English translation reads, "'Tis from our rapture that the clouds of realms above are raining down. 'Tis from our anthem that the mysteries of faith are raining down. Upon the eastern wind, Cathay's entrancing musk doth waft. This sweetly scented breeze from our curling locks is raining down. The day star of adornment hath dawned forth above the face of God. Behold that mystic truth which from his countenance is raining down." One thing that readers of the earlier translations may note in this volume is that while it's typically the policy that footnotes and descriptions and attempts to explain, even when it might seem necessary, are reduced to an absolute bare minimum in authorized translations of the Baha'i writings to attempt to minimize that any element of interpretation, and so I imagine it will be the case that commentaries may arise or study guides may arise in which people look into the original terms and bring out certain aspects of the meaning which may yet escape us in the English translation. So this is the opening work of the volume, and it sets that initial mystic tone, and it's followed by a number of other tablets which are all united by the idea of mystic journey. And it allows us, I think, although only a few extra items have been added to what was previously the publication of the Seven Valleys and the Four Valleys as a single volume, although only a few extra items have been added, these extra tablets, I think, allow us to see certain themes with a clarity that we might not have had before. As one example, it was possible. It was certainly my case. Growing up and reading this volume as a child and as a young adult, it was possible in the past to read the Seven Valleys and the Four Valleys as describing one single scheme, one single path of approach comprising different steps. The Seven Valleys and the Four Valleys were also easily seen as being almost joined as a pair of works. The Four Valleys could almost be seen as a successor to the Seven Valleys, because after all, at the end of the Seven Valleys, towards the very end, Baha'u'llah, in reference to the last of the seven stages, says this stage is the first gate of the heart's citadel, that is man's first entrance to the city of the heart. And the heart is endowed with four stages, which would be recounted should a kindred soul be found. And then the Four Valleys comes conveniently on the next page. So I think a lot of people read it as, well, we're talking about one scheme here, and then it's just a matter of maybe decoding, where am I in this scheme? And it, I think, perhaps invited a way of reading the nature of the mystical journey, which tended to schematize it. Whereas the additional tablets which have now been added to the volume, while at once affirming the general outlines of the stages of the mystic quest, also allow us to deconstruct the notion of the mystic journey. And let me explain a little bit what I mean by this. Baha'u'llah refers to his own revelation as comprising different voices. We heard earlier the passage in the Epistles to the Son of the Wolf where Baha'u'llah says that sometimes he speaks in the language of the lawgiver and sometimes in that of the truth seeker. In his Surah of the Temple, he writes that we have revealed our verses in 9 different modes. He doesn't, unfortunately, at any point say exactly what those 9 modes are, but the idea that there are these different modalities of revelation remains. And what we might imagine is happening here is that Baha'u'llah's writings are implicitly answering a certain fundamental problem with the written word, a problem with how meaning is communicated through words. And this problem with the written word was initially identified by Plato in his dialogue Phaedrus 2,500 years ago. And he puts the problem in the following terms. He says, once a thing is put in writing, the composition, whatever it may be, drifts all over the place, getting into the hands not only of those who understand it, but equally of those who have no business with it. It doesn't know how to address the right people and not address the wrong. The document, once it's set loose upon the world, has no control over its audience. And this was a problem with the whole, with writing that even the ancient Greeks realized. And we kind of take for granted now, and I think we don't put due consideration to this fundamental problem because the audience is varied. The kinds of readers of words are very different. Now, that's usually not a problem. Say, if you're writing a scientific article, you can assume that it's going to be a scientific audience that reads it. If you're writing a work of fiction, you can assume that the people who purchase the book and read it will be people expecting a certain mode of discourse. And maybe even you're writing to, if you're writing romance novels or you're writing science fiction, you even have some idea of the crowd that's likely to be reading your book. There's a unique, let's say, problem when it comes to the prophet who is leaving behind words that are meant to be read by everyone. But everyone is not in the same degree of understanding. So who is the audience? What are you to do if you're the prophet? Try to put yourself for a moment in the position of the prophet. You have to say some words that you know are going to be written down. They're going to be read by everyone. And everyone's going to treat it with a certain degree of authority and will take away from it something according to their own understanding. So how do you address yourself to the fact that you're going to have multiple audiences, but you can only write certain words? And the solution I propose, well, you have 9 modes of revelation. There's actually 2 possible solutions. One is you reveal in different modes, and you figure different people are going to read those different sorts of modes. So he's written mystical tablets, so the mystically inclined people will read those. And he reveals laws, so the people interested in the laws will reveal those. But at the same time, and maybe a second possibility, is realizing that everyone is going to be reading all of these works. One finds a way to speak in multiple voices simultaneously. In other words, one layers into the text different themes, which those who have an ear for certain of the tonalities will catch those meanings, and those who have an ear for the different overtones or undertones will catch those. This is something that no normal person can do, right? Even the best writers, the most accomplished novelists and nonfiction writers typically can only write to one audience at a time. But in Revelation, you find it has multivalence to it. It's almost as though multiple things are being said at the same time. With the parables of Jesus, for example, there's an outer meaning and an inner meaning. Jesus gives the parable, and then he says, "He that hath an ear, let him hear." And so that there are going to be those who will understand in a certain way, but those with the true understanding of it will get the real point of what's being said. But both audiences need to be addressed. Baha'u'llah says it in the following terms in his book of Certitude, quoting an Islamic tradition. He says, "We speak one word, and by it we intend 170 meanings. Each one of these meanings we can explain." So it's my proposal that that's one way of approaching this volume. And in particular, this is one way of approaching the 7 Valleys, which is the central mystical work in this volume. It strikes me as being a great example of Baha'u'llah saying 2 things at once. There's something he's saying on the surface, and there's something he's saying beneath the surface. And only those who have the ear to hear it will hear what he's saying beneath the surface. On the surface, the 7 Valleys is a recapitulation, even, or a restatement, a summarization, with some elaboration, of an earlier work by the famous Sufi poet Fariduddin Attar, writing in the 800 years previously. The poem, "The Conference of the Birds," describes the journey of the sea morgue of the 30 birds to attain the sea morgue, who was the final object of their quest. These 30 birds traversed 7 valleys, and at the end of the last valley, they attained the sea morgue, the object of their quest. And the fact that it was 30 birds, and the object of their quest was also named 30 birds, is perhaps a bit of a spoiler alert as to what the end of the Conference of the Birds anyway yields, which is that one at the end of the spiritual quest, one finds that the light of the light of God is shining within, and that ultimately, as Baha'u'llah writes in the Hidden Words, turn thy sight unto thyself, that thou mayest find me standing within thee, mighty, powerful, and self-subsisting. So, on its outer meaning, what Baha'u'llah is doing is recapitulating a conventional, not conventional, but let's say a Sufi text which is part of the canon that everybody was already familiar with. And the stages of the valleys, these stages of the mystical search, from search through love to knowledge, unity, contentment, wonderment, true poverty, and absolute nothingness, are by and large the same stages in Attar's work. But another meaning is being expressed in the Seven Valleys. It is not merely a textbook for the mystical journey intended for individual spiritual seekers in the path. At the same time, the Seven Valleys is a profound preparation for the inauguration of a new epoch in the spiritual history of the planet. It has a collective purpose as well as an individual purpose. It is laying the foundations for the announcement of a new revelation. And there is a problem in the world that Baha'u'llah is introducing the solution to in the Seven Valleys. So he's solving not just the problem of how an individual reaches the ultimate transcendent goal and purpose of their existence, he's also laying the groundwork for the solution of real-world problems. The major real-world problem of which that Baha'u'llah addresses is the problem of religious conflict. How does Baha'u'llah address the problem of religious conflict in the Seven Valleys? He gives us a way of understanding how it is that the religions can be very different in their appearance, but yet fully unified and harmonized underneath the surface. In the Seven Valleys, the journeys of the seeker recapitulate these journeys in one's understanding of the nature of religion. It begins with what Baha'u'llah calls the first three valleys of search and love and knowledge. What Baha'u'llah calls stages of limitation. Even though the seeker is exposed to and experiences varying degrees of spiritual insight and upliftment in these first three stages, they're all fundamentally limited by the fact that the seeker is seeing through the eye of differentiation. They're seeing things. The seeker is seeing the divine truths everywhere, but fundamentally the truths that are being seen here are different from the truths that are being seen there. When the seeker enters the fourth valley, the Valley of Unity, and this is where there's a bit of a correction to the translation, which I think helps a bit. In the new translation, in accordance really quite literally with the original text, Baha'u'llah refers to the seeker arriving at the first stage of unity. So the Valley of Unity is not just unity and then all the others, but the arrival at the fourth valley is really the arrival at the first stage of unity. And all of the valleys which follow it can be seen as gradations within the overall stage of unity. So the seven valleys then can be seen as dividing into the first three, which are stages of limitation, and the last four, which are varying stages of unity. Within the stages of limitation, the seeker sees the prophets as all speaking the truth, but they're all speaking different truths. Whereas from the perspective of the last four stages, the seeker doesn't distinguish the difference. The seeker regards the mention of any difference as being grievous error, and instead sees everything through the eye of unity. It's in these later stages also that the ability to differentiate this from that is gradually removed in the later stages. The ability to say anything at all about those later stages also dissolves until in the last part of the journey, Baha'u'llah says, the tongue faileth in describing these three valleys, and speech falleth short. The pen steppeth not into this arena, the ink leaveth only a blot. So the suggestion I would like to make is that Baha'u'llah is using the occasion of the mystical genre as an opportunity to make a larger and deeper point. He's making a larger point about the underlying unity which lies behind the world of differences, a point which has to be made to understand the depth of the Baha'i principle of the unity of religions, which doesn't ignore the differences. It sees that the differences are there, but it argues that there's a stage in which one connects with their deeper unity. And Baha'u'llah, of course, is also setting the stage for his own prophetic declaration. Indeed, later in Baha'u'llah's lifetime, in Akka, asked about the seven valleys, he seems to relativize the mystic seeker aspect of it in the following words. He says, "This treatise was revealed in the language of the people in the days prior to our declaration. The occasion for its revelation was the receipt of a letter addressed to the Most Holy Court in Iraq from a man of Sunni persuasion who is both a scholar and a mystic. This treatise was therefore revealed in accordance with divine wisdom in the manner that was current amongst the people. However, in this day, every soul who hath fixed his gaze upon the supreme horizon and hath recognized the one true God hath verily attained unto every one of the seven valleys or seven stages mentioned therein. For in this revelation every idle fancy hath been cleft asunder, and all have been instructed, when once they have recognized God, to acquire such knowledge as can profit humanity, and to forsake the pursuit of imaginary attainments." So Baha'u'llah, I think, himself is inviting us to look at the seven valleys in different terms than what it seems to be on the surface. And he's inviting us also in the seven valleys and in the tablets that follow to embrace the true diversity of the human race. Because what Baha'u'llah maps out for us in these various tablets is not a single monolithic pathway, but a number of different pathways that vary in different ways. He maps out different kinds of mystical languages, some of which are expressed in the format of stages, and others even which transcend the very concept of stages. All of these are part of the legitimate and true, each in its relative sense, of the human expression of the encounter with the divine. This opens the door to the possibility of the embrace of real diversity, not the easy diversity, which is the diversity of language, of dress, of regional cuisine, which is easy for us to celebrate, but the hard diversity of fundamentally different kinds of beliefs about and approaches to the divine. Baha'u'llah enables us to harmonize those by acknowledging and mapping out these different apparently contradictory approaches and ways of looking at the world, but assures us that although these roads are as many as the breaths of the seekers, they end up at the same ultimate goal. As an example of this, in the tablet from the B to the H, which is the third tablet in the volume, Baha'u'llah makes this especially clear point that differences of opinion simply cannot be avoided. He says, "But since all do not possess the same degree of spiritual understanding, certain statements will inevitably be made, and there shall arise as a consequence as many differing opinions as there are human minds, and as many divergent beliefs as there are created things. This is certain and settled, and can in no wise be averted. Our aim is that thou shouldst urge all the believers to show forth kindness and mercy, and to overlook certain shortcomings among them, that differences may be dispelled, true harmony be established, and the censure and reproach, the hatred and dissension seen among the peoples of former times may not arise anew. So the mystical tablets in this volume, including when you put them all together, the 7 valleys and this tablet to the B from the B to the H and the 4 valleys and the others, they elude our attempts to schematize the mystical journey. That the subtle alchemy of spiritual progress cannot be reduced to a fixed algebra is highlighted by several shorter tablets published in this volume for the first time, written in the same voice and during the same period in Baghdad, that provide alternate descriptions of the pathways of spiritual search and their necessary dependency on the conditions and inclinations of the seekers. So the tablet from the B to the H, which I just read a passage from, asserts that the degrees of wayfaring are countless. He elaborates upon 3 different approaches to the spiritual quest in relation to the stations of affirmation and negation, acknowledges the inevitability of differences of opinion and diverging beliefs among the peoples of the world, and encourages the faithful to embrace and transcend rather than oppose and negate these differences. The brief and unnamed 4th tablet encapsulates the stages of spiritual search in a slightly different order, again confounding the attempted work of the schematist. The 5th tablet, the brief tablet to Shams, reprises the theme of search and striving in the path of spiritual illumination and links it in barely veiled terms to the disclosure of Baha'u'llah's as yet hidden messianic secret. The 6th tablet, addressed to the lion-hearted soul, contains a deep exploration of the variances in the perceptions of mystical wayfarers and attributes these variances to their necessarily differing perspectives, rather than to that ultimate reality, which is the object of their search and which is itself beyond all name or description, singleness or plurality. The volume closes with the tablet already widely known as the 4 valleys. Although this tablet bears a resemblance to the 7 valleys in its poetic force and eloquence, its abundant allusions to the Persian literary and mystical tradition, and its underlying intent and outlook, the text does not contain, in fact, a single mention of valleys, nor does it describe a progression through stages and stations. Rather, it elaborates 4 different means of approach to the divine, through the path of the self, of the intellect, of love, and of the inmost heart. It warns of the dangers inherent in revealing the secrets associated with the latter stage, and alludes to the imminence of its author's approaching declaration. And apart from the tablets that are found in this volume, an important work of Baha'u'llah, which should be regarded as an essential companion to the present volume, is Gems of Divine Mysteries, a translation of which was published separately in 2002. Revealed during the same Baghdad period, it also describes a spiritual journey through 7 stages, and at the same time explains the cause of the rejection of the prophets of the past, highlights the dangers of a literal reading of Scripture, elucidates a number of biblical symbols and allusions, and asserts the continuity of divine revelation. As such, it acts as a thematic bridge between these 2 modes of revelation, between his foremost doctrinal and mystical works, and imparts new understandings to both. Similarly, also, the Gems of Divine Mysteries accomplishes this same feat of speaking in 2 different languages at the same time as Baha'u'llah performed in the 7 valleys. In an external sort of extrinsic sense, it's a treatise on mystical wayfaring, but at the same time he's preparing that ground for his approaching declaration and preparing the theological territory that has to be mapped out as a prelude to a true recognition of the oneness of religion. So in the same vein as the Gems of Divine Mysteries acts as a thematic bridge between Baha'u'llah's Book of Certitude and his other mystical works, the entirety of the works appearing in this volume can be seen as a bridge connecting the mystical traditions of the past to the mystical underpinnings of the present age of human unity. by asserting that the ultimate and ineffable object of all spiritual search is but one, and yet can be viewed under different lights, by showing how diametrically opposing views can be as seamlessly connected as the poles of a sphere are joined through its meridian lines, by calling upon his followers to view all things with the eye of oneness rather than that of multiplicity. Baha'u'llah opens wide the portals of true mystical union in the individual realm and the doors of unity in the social realm. And so the key takeaways that I personally take from my reading of these tablets is this are the ideas of Baha'u'llah speaking to multiple audiences, of referring at once to the timeless truths about the mystical journey and the fact of the mystical journey that the endpoint is a self-renunciation or even self-annihilation that is a prelude to immortality, but that also prepares the way for his own declaration, that tells us that the spiritual journey is not a rigid geometrical progression that's true for all souls at all times in the same way, that acknowledges that substantial differences in perspective are a feature and not a bug of the human spirit, and that must be embraced, or at the very least treated with patience and forbearance. And the ultimate goal in all of this is to find a path through to accomplishing the ultimate goal of Baha'u'llah's revelation, which is the reconciliation of differences not just between between individuals, but between religions. Reiterating the passage that I began with, Baha'u'llah summed it up so beautifully in saying that ye are the fruits of one tree and the leaves of one branch. Deal ye one with another with the utmost love and harmony, with friendliness and fellowship. He who's the day star of truth beareth me witness. So powerful is the light of unity that it can illuminate the whole earth. So that was all the comments I had prepared, but this might be a good moment to open the floor for discussion or questions or reactions. Yeah.
I just had a question. What would be a summary of the major differences in the translation of the 7 and 4 valleys, and what inspired the need for this new translation?
One of the big reasons I believe was the desire to harmonize the existing authorized translations with the translations of Shoghi Effendi, which embed a certain choice in the translation of technical terms and in general giving us a kind of vocabulary of revelation, which, when applied consistently across all of the works of the revelation, allow us better to compare, from one tablet to the next. In the case of the 7 valleys and the 4 valleys, they were beautifully translated. I don't think there's any question that they're absolutely gorgeous. But in a number of cases where it would have been helpful to use words and terms in the way that Shoghi Effendi had translated it, that was done in order to provide better points of connection across the entirety of Baha'u'llah's revelation. Of course, there's an enormous amount yet to be translated, and what has already been translated is, by one estimation, about 5% of the totality of the revelation. Actually, I picked up the Bible yesterday and looked at, what gets you 5% of the way into the Bible, and that gets you just after the end of Genesis. Mm-hmm. So, just by brute word count, what we have in English is equivalent to having, just past the book of Genesis in the Bible. That's a bit of an unfair comparison because what has been translated has been carefully selected to represent the most powerful and relevant bits of the revelation. And it's also true that a great deal of what remains to be untranslated is in the domain of personal guidance or reiteration of themes, because Baha'u'llah was speaking to hundreds of followers who weren't all in contact with each other. And so there's a lot of repetition within his tablets, because he's not just addressing, again, one audience. This problem of audience, again, comes up. And so when looks at things like trying to estimate how much of the revelation remains to be translated, one has to take that into consideration. And certainly the question arises, why retranslate something when there's so much out there that's yet to be translated? And I think one answer is that for such a central tablet, particularly as the Seven Valleys, which Shoghi Effendi has called Baha'u'llah's preeminent mystical work, it's important that for the centuries to come, that the vocabulary and style of it be harmonized with the authoritative translations of Shoghi Effendi. And also there are many other volumes planned and to come that will be bringing out greater amounts of new material.
Sorry, who was the original translator of Seven Valleys?
Marzieh Gale and Ali Kuli Khan. Marzieh, as a side point, Marzieh Gale was actually my first Persian teacher when I was in an undergraduate. And I remember my senior year, she lived in San Francisco, and I would drive once a week. I would drive into San Francisco and spend the evening with her and get a Persian lesson from her and have dinner. Because the young woman who's taking care of her was a friend of mine, and so that was I had an in to hang out with Marzieh Gale for a few months. And of course, at that time, I had no idea that I would I had no plans to study Persian seriously or to.
She's probably been helping you.
But I'd like to think that she really had an incredible number of incredible body of inspired work.
In the Four Valleys, I was comparing some of the differences, and I noticed one addition that seems to contradict a little bit what you're saying. Mm-hmm. Is the word only, so that there's I think I'll have to find it, but it says that the modes are only four, and that wasn't present in the other translation. So I was curious about that, because it seems to indicate that you should look through this lens to find four paths. Is there a backstory on that at all? Or?
No, except that, one doesn't come at the translation work with an idea that this larger point is going to be proved, and now the translations are going to be, adjusted to make the point. And particularly with the Four Valleys, I think I'm not aware of Shoghi Effendi having said anything officially about the translation, but I think in a Pilgrim note, he said something about how it was difficult in some places to understand the meaning of that particular tablet, and that a retranslation would be necessary. And if there's an only that's been put in, it's definitely because it's there in the text.
Yeah. They that seek to ascend the heaven of mystic wayfaring are of four kinds only.
Yeah. It's interesting because in each of these other tablets he gives other ways of doing it. So
he mentions the four kinds of love too, and maybe that it's related. Isn't it in the Seven Four Valleys that he mentions the four kinds of love?
The journeys and the pathway of love. Yeah.
So maybe in reference to the four types of loves, there are only four ways.
Maybe there's a temptation to break things into fours. The Bab did this a lot, and the book Gate of the Heart does a fantastic job of pulling together at least a dozen different ways in which the Bab divides everything into four. He divides his own writings into four different modes, and then he adds a fifth mode, which he calls the Persian mode, which recapitulates the first four modes, which are in Arabic. And so it all comes back to these groupings of four, which seem to be almost like canonical ways of dividing things up. from the earliest times, the ancient Greeks, believed that the universe broke into, fundamentally it bifurcates, and then into active and passive, or an active force and its recipient, and then each of those is twinned. So you have two twin agents and twin patients, and that ended up undergirding the Greek idea of the four elements of fire and water and air and earth underlying everything. And there are many other examples besides of a kind of canonical division of things into four. And it's tempting to try to line up all the fours with each other and say, okay, well, what does fire, correlate with among these other 10 or 20 different, groupings of four that you find throughout the history of religious thought, and particularly in the writings of the Bab, and you find it also in the writings of Baha'u'llah. That doesn't answer, I think, why he said four and four only, when it seems from the context of these other tablets that he's opening up rather than narrowing the discourse. He's opening us up to thinking of different ways of thinking. And one of the ways Baha'u'llah describes of thinking about the mystical journey is a stage in which one is beyond stages. A stage in which names and attributes become an encumbrance. And so there are degrees in the, let's say, in the ascent of human consciousness, when the whole project of dividing things up becomes more of a limitation on one's approach to the truth. And maybe in these earlier stages, there are only four, seen through a particular lens, that's how it is. Air, earth, fire, and water. There's nothing besides that, or however you'd like to divide it up. But Baha'u'llah is quite clear in, and even these new tablets aren't unique in giving us hints of that. The Seven Valleys itself already gave us a hint of that in the tablet of, in the Valley of Knowledge or Unity, I can't remember which one, where he talks about firstness and lastness. He says he said the seeker reaches a point where first and last are the same, and then he beyond that he reaches a further stage where he flies from all that is first and repulses all that is last. So Baha'u'llah, even in the Seven Valleys, seems to describe a succession of points of view in which initially one very clearly divides things up, right and wrong. That's the classic way of dividing things up. And you reach a certain point where, well, right and wrong is relative. That has to be understood within a careful context, because right and wrong also need to be clearly defined in the world, so that the world can keep turning on its axis, and so that governments can function and so forth. But the more you delve into the division of things, the more you realize that the stark categories fall away, and you're left with a single truth which is expressed relatively in different ways. And Baha'u'llah seems to suggest that even that degree beyond which one sees everything as relatively true, Baha'u'llah says there are issues with that stage as well. There are dangers associated with that stage as well. And he says this in the final tablet to the lion-hearted soul. He describes all the impediments and veils at these different stages. And he says at the stage of, you can reach a stage where you think you have it figured out, but you're still attached to names and attributes. Just like I think Abdu'l-Baha says in the visitation tablet about being detached from all things within thy holy precincts, and other tablets that refer to being detached from names and attributes, which describes a kind of a station in which I think one is seeing through the lens of unity versus the lens of distinction. But Baha'u'llah says there is a danger at this stage, and that danger is self-conceit. The danger is that one comes to the belief that one has it all figured out. And Baha'u'llah deals with that particular danger so beautifully in Gems of Divine Mysteries, which unfortunately is not in this volume. It would have been, I think it would have been lovely if they were bundled up together, because then you have kind of one big sort of mystical blast, in one tablet, in one volume. But I'm sure all these volumes are going to be remixed and republished, just as the U.S. Publishing Trust is doing it. But at the end of Gems of Divine Mysteries, Baha'u'llah refers to the seeker traversing all these stages and attaining all these journeys, and then he says, if the seeker, having attained all these journeys, should come to possess the least trace of pride and vainglory, Baha'u'llah said, he would be at that very moment returned to the first stage in the journey without realizing it. So there's a real danger, that veil of conceit is a real danger, even for people who have traversed what seems like, most of the way of the journey and are well into the realms of unity and seeing seeing through the eye of unity.
When the book Gems of Divine Mysteries was published, I thought it was really interesting that, you saw elements of both the Seven Valleys and the Book of Certitude. And so then, I was thinking, in a way, you might think of the Book of Certitude as humankind's collective spiritual journey. And the Seven Valleys, I know this is really oversimplified, but this was the way I was, my musings, that the Seven Valleys was more the individual spiritual journey. And the Gems of Divine Mysteries, he sort of merges these two together.
Yeah.
And if you look at it from that lens and read the Seven Valleys from that point of view, you can sort of think of, and put the idea of, okay, if we thought of this as humankind's collective journey, then, Baha'u'llah's revelation will last 500,000 years. Mm-hmm. And so this first stage of unity, maybe this is where we're at collectively. Yeah. Then there's all this other unfolding over 5,000 centuries. You sort of alluded to that, so I thought I would.
There's actually, on that 500,000, there's actually a tablet of Abdu'l-Baha where he says, in reference to the 500,000 years, he says, this is not meant literally. He said, the meaning is a long time. Many generations. But yeah, it's certainly a long time. And just to maybe riff off of that a little bit, I also think of the seven valleys almost as a prelude to the Kitab-i-Gan, and it's bridged by Gems of Divine Mysteries. It's almost as though Baha'u'llah had an audience at the beginning, which were these Sufi mystics. He took on the guise of a dervish. He was living in the mountains of Kurdistan for a couple of years. He came to be known as a mystic, an alchemist, a miracle worker. And so he was addressing a particular audience, and they were expecting a particular language from him. But knowing that he had far more to convey than what they were expecting, he found a way to convey to them what they wanted to hear. Here's a tablet on the mystical journey. But really what he was saying was something far more ground-shaking and revolutionary for those who had the ear to hear it. And it becomes successively more obvious and more clear in his later writings. In the Kitab-i-Gan, he makes it, far more clear, but still it's one step away from a direct declaration of his own station, and that's reserved for a few years later. But it's almost as though you see him making use of almost in a pragmatic way, kind of divine pragmatism of making use of the opportunities and the audience that was available to him to deliver a message in a way that could be acceptable to the hearers. And the tablet that he wrote later on in Akka about the Seven Valleys, which seems to not dismiss it, but completely relativize it. It says, this is written in the language of the people, but, in this day, if you've recognized, then you've attained all those valleys. How does Baha'u'llah want us to read the Seven Valleys in light of that later tablet that he wrote? How are we to understand it? Are we to go back to it as simply a manual for spiritual journey? Well, there was already tens of thousands of pages of Sufi texts that gave this, starting with Attar's Conference of the Birds and Rumi and Ibn al-Arabi and others in Persian and Arabic, that it seemed sufficiently discoursed on the topic of spiritual journey. And what Baha'u'llah says about spiritual journey largely maps onto these to these previous ideas. But what Baha'u'llah is bringing, which is brand new, is this whole new theological ground that enables for the first time a bridging of these previously unbridgeable chasms between East and West, between, say, a Buddhist, a Hindu, a Taoist way of thinking, and a Christian, Judeo-Christian Islamic way of thinking, just for starters. Baha'u'llah says, this is the tree which is neither of the East nor of the West. And I think he really meant that. But to really mean that requires laying certain theological foundations that don't entirely fit comfortably within our standard Judeo-Christian Islamic way of carving up the world. It's carved up according to different kinds of principles. I cut off a question over here.
No, just a comment really I was going to make, this sort of the comparison of whether something is applicable at an individual level, whether this is meant for a collective level. It's almost is the difference that we would make between looking at something at a micro level or a macro level. And often, in the universe, whatever you look at the micro level, you will almost, invariably find the same pattern repeated at the macro level. So what sometimes is applied to us as individual can well be applied to us as a collective level as well. So it's just taking the same themes but applying it as a different dimension.
This idea of repetition of archetypes is to me, one of the most exciting ideas in the Baha'i writings, and it echoes what is seen in the physical world. The atoms are patterned after suns and drops are patterned after seas. You see certain processes which are repeated at higher levels. I mean, fractals are a great example. And but beyond that, Baha'u'llah gives a principle for this in a tablet that is, I think it's somewhere in Ma'adeh Asmani. But Baha'u'llah says, it's in the Lawh-e Haqqun Nas of Baha'u'llah, which hasn't yet been translated. But he says, everything that exists in this physical world, every form, every substance, every name, every attribute, he says, has a corresponding existence in each of the worlds of God. It's not just even a spiritual mirrors physical, which although that is also true, he takes it and it's almost like Russian dolls. Every time you crack one open, there's something inside it, and there's something inside of that, and it's a repetition of archetypes. It's a repetition of patterns which exist at each level of creation. And so we shouldn't be surprised then to find so many examples of that in the Baha'i writings. I mean, one of the preeminent ones related to this question of search is there's certain processes at the individual level which are repeated at the collective level. So the individual moves through stages of infancy, childhood, rebellious adolescence, maturity, old age, and senescence, and finally death. And that's the same thing with civilizations, with the human race as a whole. It moves through cycles of birth and death. And when one understands that, one sees patterns everywhere. There's, of course, a danger in that, because when one is primed to see patterns everywhere, of course, you're going to see the patterns everywhere. How do you know when you're seeing a real pattern, and how do you know when you're not? That's the kind of danger that lies behind, say, astrology. Wanting to find patterns in everything, and of course, the harder you look, convinced that you're going to find a pattern, the likelier it is that you're going to find one. But to say that there is a danger there is not to say that it isn't at the same time a profound truth of the world. It's just a matter that one has to be very careful that one doesn't jump off the deep end, I guess. Yeah.
Question: how might we define mysticism now, and what does it mean in this day and age?
That's a great question. In a way, it's no different than it was when Attar was writing Conference of the Birds in 1200. There's a Baha'u'llah. I don't think in recapitulating the mystical journey, but really having another message underneath it, I don't think that invalidates the truth of the mystical of the stages themselves, which overall are pretty consistent. I mean, there's variations, And there are stages where even the whole idea of stages becomes relativized. But if you look at the several places now where we've seen Baha'u'llah lay out, search, love, knowledge, unity, contentment, wonderment, self-annihilation followed by immortality, with certain variations, there's a kind of universality behind that, which is that one enters a period of search, one has relative degrees of inspiration before one comes to an understanding of the unity behind all the different appearances and experiences. And then finally there's a state of death, of the death of the self, which is a necessary prelude to the spiritual rebirth, and the attainment of and this is where just ending with the seven valleys would do a great disservice to the richness of it, because the seven valleys ends with valley number 7, Fana, with the stage of true poverty and absolute nothingness, as it was translated in the original. And the Sufis always knew that beyond Fana is Baqa. Beyond the annihilation lies eternity, lies immortality. But it wasn't explicitly stated in the seven valleys, but it is mentioned in some of these other tablets in this new volume, and it's also explicitly mentioned in Gems of Divine Mysteries. Gems of Divine Mysteries actually sort of one-ups it and even mentions another valley beyond that of eternity, which is a valley which has no name and cannot even be mentioned. But that maps onto these other ideas of Baha'u'llah in this volume about how at some stage, the idea of stages itself becomes dissolves, and that might map onto that eighth or ninth valley in Gems of Divine Mysteries. And so it seems to me that the idea of mysticism is as eternally true in the Baha'i writings as it has always been. That there is a journey for each individual soul that passes through a recognition of one's utter insignificance at some point before one gets to the end, and a rediscovery of one's true immortality. But that true immortality, Baqa, which lies on the other side of Fana, it seems to me can't be the simplified idea of immortality that we have, where we think of ourselves in all its aspects, our memories and every aspect of our personality and so forth, as being transferred to an invisible realm. Because how much of that is actually part of the self that gets burned away? Where Baha'u'llah says in the seven valleys, everything that the seeker hath from heart, from heart to skin in the old translation, is burned away, so nothing remains but the friend. What remains after? Do you get all that stuff back? After you pass through Fana into Baqa, do you get back all the skin and the bones and the sort of elements of personality, or do you traverse beyond that to a point where one realizes that one's immortality is a ray of the divine light? Baha'u'llah, I think, alludes to this in the Seven Valleys, where he says, "Thou art." Now I can't even quote it right, but he basically says that our eternity, that the immortality that we possess is God's immortality. It's the immortality of the divine. In other words, it's not the immortality of that which is ephemeral within us. But these are all highly personal speculations about what no one knows, right? I mean, we're talking about a realm which is personally and subjectively experienced, obviously. Yeah.
So, Baha'u'llah says that the word of God is the king of words and its pervasive influence is incalculable. So even if we're not understanding, it's affecting us, right? It's making us. Yeah. The undertones and the overtones may be vibrating our souls, even if we're not consciously aware of it. Yeah, those 72 meanings are bouncing around in our subconscious, even if we're only getting one of them.
And your journey to the ultimate is not necessarily linear, right? Within individual person, but yet the valleys represent a linear sequence. But perhaps I'm not exactly understanding the reason for it.
Yeah, they're presented as linear, as though one just goes from one to the next.
So,
But,
yes,
but again, the Gens of Divine Mysteries presents a possibility of retrograde motion.
yes.
So we know that that's possible.
So
Several
at
times.
one moment you could be at several stages or one stage back and forth.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about the seven valleys sort of, and to try to, I don't know, put it in your head at the same time as you're thinking about the four valleys, because if there's 7 stages that the seeker traverses, and maybe in these other tablets sometimes there's 6 or 8, or and sometimes they're slightly different in their order or sequence. In the four valleys, it's not stages along the journey; it's 4 different kinds of seekers. And he isn't even talking necessarily about seekers going from one stage to the other. It's possible to read the four valleys as he's just describing 4 different ways of being, ways of navigating the world spiritually, and people may be born into one and tend to stay in one, and maybe switching lanes to another one is a rare occurrence or something like that. And so when you try to add all those together, it seems to me, at least, to erode the interpretation of spiritual journey in an overly schematic form, in an overly kind of sequential form, that, well, it has to be from this to that to that. It's just described in so many different ways in these mystical tablets. It just seems to me to just blow open the idea of it, and it forces us to think about what's really being said underneath the surface.
But doesn't Baha'u'llah describe that, having described all the 7 valleys, he mentions that in the twinkling of an eye, the wayfarer might traverse
Can traverse all of them.
the whole valley.
Yeah.
So it kind of blurs the distinctions between all these different stages. So it's not necessarily that you have to one by one go through each and every one of them, okay, and give yourself tick boxes and then move on to the next.
Yeah.
It's
but it's nevertheless helpful, to think about each one and how one may
it's
relate to
beautiful
it personally.
understand it, I guess.
Yeah,
A divine mystery.
Yeah.
that's for sure.
In the book, Baha'u'llah uses the story of the Layla and Majnun,
Yeah.
which is it's a very mystical and ancient story. That I think maybe it was used in the ancient Persian Shahnameh, like 2,000 years ago, right? So many years ago.
Nizami, I think, was the first, and it was around 10 or 1100 AD. It goes back quite a ways in Arabic.
And the story is actually very mystical. If you would like to allude to that a little bit.
Well, I named my oldest daughter after
Yes.
Layla, after that poem. But yes, that's one of the ways in which there's let's say, an echoing, an archetype, a sort of repetition of patterns that human love in the world, the hormones and the butterflies and all of that is a pattern for a higher kind of love. The one is a symbol and if one reads it aright, a signpost that points one in the direction of higher kinds of love. For many, the experience of the higher is predicated on and depends on having had the experience of the lower. And I think that was the case for many of the mystics. And you read, for instance, about Rumi and his ecstatic spiritual love for Shamsi Tabriz, which kind of broke his soul wide open and exposed him to depths of feeling that of spiritual feeling. We're talking about a love for another individual that opened doorways to higher kinds of love. And the story of Layla Majnun is a perfect example of that. it's so moving. I recommend reading there are good translations of it out there, of the story of Layla and Majnun, and it's really heartrending.
The Majnun was looking in the dust, looking for Layla, and
His tears flowing down.
Tears, yeah,
He said, "Alas for thee, thou seekest for Layla in the dust."
in the dust.
And he said, "I seek her everywhere. Happily somewhere I may find her."
I noticed as you were talking, you were talking about Baha'u'llah's words, and then you said, and Abdul Baha said this, and then you said, Shoghi Effendi said that.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering about how we can understand Baha'u'llah's writings by reading his writings, reading Abdul Baha, reading Shoghi Effendi, House of Justice, then go back.
Oh, yeah.
Keep that circle going if we understand.
Yeah.
Help us understand.
They all inform each other. Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes from just one, you only get like one, I don't know, hemisphere, and you don't even get any of the other side of it until you look at another author. Shoghi Effendi put it so beautifully, where he said the writings are like a sphere, and they're points, poles apart, and in between are the thoughts and ideas that unite them. And I think that's the case with the sources of Baha'i writings and authoritative interpretation. That sometimes you need to go to a completely different author to get that other side of the sphere. So thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoyed
Thank you.